Oh my goodness, is it happening? Are we here? Can you hear me? Can you see me? Grade school's in session. Welcome everybody to another round of grade school. I'm here for you guys today. We're going AMA, we're going freestyle. Whatever questions, whatever topics you guys have in the wide world of color grading and DaVinci Resolve, I'm here to discuss with you, to learn about with you, to give you the answers if I got them. Let me know in the chat. Who's in the chat? Let me see who's here. My buddy Gadali's here with me. What's going on, G? Oh, you know what? Let's make sure that all my friends can hear you, G. I bet they probably can't. One sec. There's always this last little thing I gotta do. Okay, tell us something else, buddy.
Well, I'm here at home. I've been watching a lot of movies this weekend,
What's the
and
last movie that you watched?
I watched Mirror Mask. It's a surreal fantasy from 2004 that I'd not heard of before, and I thought I'd give it a shot. It was kind of cool.
Mirror Mask? Okay. Give us what's the score on the 5-star scale?
Uh, I like to rate movies with two scores. One being what is the overall quality, and what's my overall satisfaction. And I'd say quality-wise, like how good they did stuff, I'd give it let's say 3.5 stars. And then satisfaction, I'd give it a 3 out of 5. It was like
Okay.
good time, but not, it didn't really have the emotional weight that I thought it could have.
Well, there you have it, everybody. Mirror Mask. Make it your next at-home viewing experience.
If you want, yeah.
Yeah, if 3 to 3.5 stars, depending on the metric, entices you. All right, John's here, Tim's here, Darren Hartman's in the house, Hafiz is here, Jim Robinson, John's here. Oh man, we got a party going on here. All right, gang. Well, you guys get your topics ready. Drop your questions. What do you got in the chat? What's on your mind? What are you working on? What are you struggling with right now? I'm keen to hear about it and help you if I can. I'm trying to think of anything fun going on in my world right now with grading. I think I mentioned in last session, I have finally switched over to a dual GUI setup. So I'm not doing that. Let me just flip over to Resolve for a second here. Let's see here. Cool. So I'm not doing it for the sake of grade school because you guys wouldn't see that second GUI, but I basically got a little small kind of like portable screen down below my main GUI here. And it's super helpful for moving things like gallery and thumbnails out of the way and really just giving me more room for the node graph. That's where I feel like I was struggling. So I'm playing around a lot with that. I'm thinking a lot about this node right here and about how everything lives and dies right here in the prime node and about how we might be able to optimize what we do in there, the tools we use to do it, the way we think about things in there. I'm thinking about that node number 1 a lot. There's a video coming on node number 1 in the near future. So that's where my head's at. And other than that, I just wish we had a way to flip our gamma into linear for a node from a button. But that's my state of the union. Gadali, do we have any questions in the chat as of yet?
We do have some coming in. I also feel like there was a way to set the gamma with a shortcut, but I think that's just flipping it back with a keyboard shortcut to the timeline. I'll need to look at
Exactly.
that.
I think you can do this. You can flip it back to use timeline, but you can't flip it to anything else. So we're close, Resolve engineers, if you guys are hanging out for grade school.
All right. We have a couple people asking basically the same question. Where should the look node go in the pipeline? And also, as an add-on to that, someone was asking how does that take into account Genesis that is a sort of a one-stop output transform and print.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's chop this up. So where should the look node go in a pipeline, and how do we square that with the idea of its relationship with like our DRT or our output transform? So let's start with the big piece there. So as you guys know, if you've been watching videos for the last couple months here on the channel, we introduced some new language, not really new ideas as much as new language, but some new language surrounding this exact topic, pipeline. How do we get our image from its scene state out onto the display? And specifically, I introduced the idea of a print, okay? The print is the thing that is making your image visible. And really, as you can see, like what I have right now with these two nodes here at the timeline level of my node graph. By the way, this isn't the only place I could do what I'm going to show you right now. It's just a sensible, functional place to do it. But right now, I have what in this new sort of language that we've been using this year, what I would call a two-stage print. Okay. So to me, this is my print. It's what's turning data, albeit graded data, into an actual image. And that's true even if I happen not to have done any grading yet, but like I was talking about node number 1 a second ago here. So like, let's say I'm actually doing some grading, like some, like exposure type stuff, and then like, working my primaries, not like that, but more like this. And I'm like doing stuff, okay? And then like maybe I've balanced things. Like there's an actual live grade living underneath here. So like, there's the net of what we've done so far, okay? So if I go back to the timeline level of my node graph, even with those pieces happening upstream at the clip level of my node graph, this right here, this is my print. It's what's taking that graded stuff. Like, if I turn this off and on, there's still a grade happening here. It's just not really making much impact, right? It's not changing the fundamental truth of this image, which is that it's really more like data than an image. Are you with me so far? We need something that's actually going to put the pixels on a screen in a meaningful way. I call that the print. And there are different ways of thinking about that. There are different ways of achieving that, is a better way to put it. So you can have something like we have in Genesis, my new film emulation plugin, where everything does indeed just happen in one step, okay? So with Genesis, this would be my single stage print. It is imparting both the transformation out to the display and any creative preferential pieces along the way as well. That's the way film has always worked, like traditionally, is that it's giving us the rendering for the screen. Like it's even more exaggerated in film, which I kind of like for the sake of our concepts. With film, like you straight up have a negative. Like there's no way to look at a negative and make any heads or tails of what you're seeing until it's printed and projected, right? So it's a similar thing here. Like we have to print the image, and with film, when we print the image, not only are we getting a visible image, we're also getting a preferentially rendered image, okay? Now, with modern digital pipelines, that's often done not in one step, like we see here, but in two. So an example of that would be what I started with a moment ago. I have my technical transform, which right now is coming from OpenDRT. We just did a video on OpenDRT earlier this year that is definitely worth checking out if you want to get into DRTs and how to get better results than you're going to get with like a resolved color space transform or an ACES transform or something more vanilla like that. So this is one piece of my print, okay? This is my DRT, and this is the other piece. I consider this look right here, which right now is coming from my look development plugin Contour, but it could come from whatever we want. Like I could say, oh no, I'm not using Contour. I'm going to use, like, let's say we're going to use my free 2383 LUT, okay? So let's look at if I can find my own LUTs somewhere in here. Here we go. So here would be like my Fuji 3510, okay? So this was not necessarily meant to be used or paired with this DRT, so I'm not particularly in love with the picture that I'm seeing, but that's not really relevant right now. What's important is that, like, if I just take Contour out of the stack right now, this is also a totally valid version of what I'm talking about. It's just a two-stage print. It's a two-step print, okay? For now, let's pull this out and let's go back to Contour here. So this is my two-stage print, okay? So that's the first thing I want to call out, is that we have our overall print that can come in one step like it does with something like Genesis or a traditional like film viewing LUT, or that can come in two steps like we often do with modern color managed pipelines, where we have a DRT and a log-to-log look that's happening right before that. And that really leads us right back to where we started with this conversation, the original question: where should the look live and how should the overall pipeline look? Well, we want to start the answer with what we just looked at here. The first thing to think about is your print. What is putting your image on the screen, okay? In this case, it is a two-step print composed of Contour and my DRT. And that print should definitionally, or it should like inherently always come last. We want to do all of our grading before that point. That's why when I did my base grade over here, I'm at the clip level of my node graph right now. And for anyone who wants a recap or is unfamiliar with this, I can, like when I look at my nodes left to right here, my node sections, we go group pre-clip because I'm using groups to color manage my clips. So there's a dedicated video on how I set up my color management, why I like to do it in nodes, all that good stuff. Anything that I do here is going to happen before anything that I do here. Anything I do here is going to happen before anything that I do here at the group post clip level, which right now is empty. And finally, all this stuff is going to happen before anything that I do here at the timeline level of my node graph. Okay, so short answer, the look should always come dead last, right before the DRT if you're doing a two-stage print, or if you're doing a single-stage print like you would get, again, with Genesis or a viewing LUT, then that should just be one thing, and that also is going to come at the very end of the chain. That way, everything is feeding into that printing process. Hope that helps.
Got a question from Christopher. DRTs have become a popular topic. Is there any way that IDTs can also beyond the normal resolve CSTs and ACEs input transforms?
Oh man, fire question. This is very top of mind for me right now. So Christopher's asking like, all right, so we've got all this emphasis on DRTs or on, as they're sometimes called, ODTs. One of the things that's confusing, just as a quick side note about the whole DRT display transform piece, is how many terms there are for it that mean the same thing. You guys ever have this experience in color grading where when you finally understand something, you're like, wait, so you mean to tell me there are like these 20 different words all basically mean the same thing? Like DRT, ODT, CST, that can mean slightly something different, but it often means the exact same thing. They're all just like variations on describing the same fundamental process. Anyway, I digress. So there's all this conversation about DRTs or ODTs and the important role they play in shaping the image and in informing our grading context, if you want to call it that. And Christopher's asking like, all right, is there similar gold in looking more critically at the way we input map things? And there's sort of two answers to that. The robust answer would be like, definitely maybe, because what we can say is, you know, like if you go, I think we actually talked about this in a recent grade school, but it bears repeating because it's kind of complicated. You guys want to do a quick color science geek out detour for a second? You guys want to learn how a color space transform works under the hood and how you could actually do everything the color space transform does yourself if you wanted to? I'll take that as a resounding yes. And if you don't and you're watching this later, you can fast forward. And if you're watching in real time and you're having to wait for this part, then, you know, you can grab a cup of coffee. We won't take too long of this, but it's worth emphasizing. Here's what's happening under the hood anytime we do a CST from color space A to color space B, okay? And I'm talking specifically about in an IDT thing where we're going from a scene color space like this camera metric into another scene color space, in this case, DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. It's a three-step process that's happening anytime we do something like this. With any IDT, there is a three-step process, and it's the same three-step process whether you're using ACEs, whether you're using a Resolve CST, or any other mainstream solution. The three-step process is this. We're going to decode the log back to linear. So right now we're in this log curve where everything looks like, let's actually visualize this. Let's make it fun. So here's my log image, okay? And to visualize what's going to happen in the stages of this CST, the first step, remember 3 steps that I laid out. First step, we're going red wide gamut RGB, red log 3G10. We're going to output red wide gamut RGB, and we're going to go out to linear, okay? So that's step number 1 of this IDT. 3 steps total. We've just done the first step manually, okay? Next step up from here, we're going to do another color space transform, linear on both sides. We're going to go red wide gamut RGB to DaVinci Wide Gamut, okay? So what are we doing here? We're just changing the primaries around. It's like pretty tough to see even what's happening unless we're on a more colorful image. Like we can use, is Thatcher in the house today? Let's find out. No, I don't see you yet, Thatcher, but we're using a great tool that Thatcher put out called RGB Chips. Love this tool. RGB Chips just gives us a bunch of different colors at different exposure levels, okay? So if we look at what we're getting here, I'm going to put this into, we'll say this is a red wide gamut RGB input. What I'm doing right now doesn't matter so much as the visual that I'm trying to tee up for you in the vector scope, okay? Let's just do red log 3G10. There we go. Okay, and if we turn these pieces off, just want to orient myself to what exactly I'm seeing here. Okay, so if we look at the vector scope down here, I'm going to make this a little more visible. what's happening in this? So we're on step 2 of 3 right now, okay? Step 2, we're going to remap our colors, okay? So what's happening there is we are changing the primary set. We're basically changing what does red, green, and blue mean. This is probably even easier to do if we just limit ourselves to our primaries and our secondaries. And maybe I'm just going to clamp my output at something reasonable. Like so. That's kind of interesting. Okay, I'm getting distracted. So essentially, all we're doing here in this second step is we're remapping our colors, which is basically changing what red, green, and blue mean, okay? And now we got one more piece to go. Let's label these as we go along. So we're going to say 2 linear. Now we're going to say 2 DaVinci Wide Gamut. And now we're going to do a third step, and we're going to go. Now we're in DaVinci Wide Gamut primaries, right? But we want to get the log curve back on there. DaVinci Intermediate is a log curve as well. Okay, so check this out. This is my CST. This is my IDT. And we can actually compare and say, here it is doing it manually in these 3 steps. Let me reset whatever errant primary correction is happening there. And here's the normal CST happening here. You can see when I wipe to these, this is identical. Okay, so that's what's happening in a CST. And really the thing that I want to point out when we go into this is this stage right here. What's happening right here when I say go from red wide gamut RGB to DaVinci Wide Gamut? What's happening is a 3x3 matrix. Some of you guys know what a 3x3 matrix is. It's pretty nifty. It's represented in Resolve itself by the RGB mixer, where we're basically saying, I'm going to put red, green, and blue into this black box, and something's going to come out the other side of this black box. And the other side of the black box, what's going to come out in terms of red, green, and blue is going to be some mixture of input red, green, and blue. So it's a way of remixing, reorienting our colors, all right? All of that to say, reason I give you that whole preface is a 3x3 matrix is a very powerful instrument, and it's a very clean instrument. It is not the most robust instrument. So like it can only do linear combinations of things. So when we ask for something like, hey, move me from the response of this camera to some other primary set, or even easier example probably would be like, oh, move me into the response of another camera. It's sort of accepted and agreed on in the world of image science that like that works, but it's not terribly accurate. It's giving you an approximation, okay? And there are benefits to keeping things simple. One of them is that you're not going to get a breakage from your IDT where it's like, oh yeah, sure, you bent it into the shape it needed to be, but now you've got like some sort of issue with the way your image is breaking apart. So it's a very serviceable solution and it's very clean, but there's definitely room to explore there. Like, how could we more robustly map from whatever metric the camera was shot in into some other metric for grading, okay? There's nothing that is like immediately accessible and out there for that. I think there are some people like actually make LUTs that they claim to do more complex nonlinear things to fit, like for example, I don't know, like a Blackmagic camera into the primary set of an Alexa. These are things I haven't really had the chance to thoroughly test myself, so I can't vouch for any of them. But there is energy or curiosity in this space and people looking into it. And you're asking a good question would be the way to put it. So as is often the case here in grade school, I hope I've even if I haven't answered your question, I hope I've taken your question and stacked like 10 more interesting questions on top of it.
Alexander has a question. Do you think smoothing LUTs using external tools is a valid way to get smooth LUTs? Or do you think that's a band-aid solution over something that should have been smoother in the creation of a LUT?
I think it's a band-aid 99 out of 100 times. Unless exactly what would have needed to happen in the creation of that LUT was some generic smoothing, but that's basically never going to be the case. So yes, I think can it work? Like, yeah, it can sometimes work, but it's very rarely it's very rarely the ideal. I'd say it is, never say never, but it is virtually never the ideal way to go about it. You want to go in and identify the root cause. Like, it's It's maybe not quite this extreme, but it's a bit like saying, oh, my check oil light is on my car. So I'm going to put a little piece of gaff tape over that light. And now I don't have a check oil or a check engine light problem anymore. Well, that's not true. You just don't have an indicator telling you that you have a problem anymore. Similar thing with like smoothing things out. Like I like to believe that when we get artifacts or bugs or misbehaviors in LUTs, it's almost never just something that's like, oh, that's annoying. It just needs to be solved. Like it needs to be, the switch needs to be flipped into another position. There is something to be solved, but there's usually a creative problem to be solved. Like how is the LUT handling, I'll give you guys an example that's fresh in mind for me because we just did a workshop a couple weeks ago for my new film plugin Genesis, and it was a really fun workshop because I had my partners, Dr. Mitch Bogdanowicz and Steve Yedlin, ASC, joining me, and we got to put on a 3-day workshop about working with film and working with the plugin. And the example that I'm thinking of is something that my friend Steve mentioned on the third day when he was talking about his LUT that he's been developing and refining and shooting under for many years now as a cinematographer, that only when they went out and shot the lightsabers for Star Wars The Last Jedi did they realize there was something that needed to be solved in the way that very, very high saturation, high exposure greens were being rendered by the LUT. But it wasn't something as simple as like, oh, we need to fix that behavior. Like you could kind of look at it that way from the 20,000 foot view. But what's really going on is something deeper of like, all right, well, why is it doing that? What in my process, what in my design is producing that outcome, as opposed to like just needing to put a Band-Aid on it, as you said there, Alexander. So I think most of the time, if it's possible, if the original assets and design is available to you, it is worth the effort to go in there and figure out like, why is this misbehaving and what would I like to see it do instead?
Could you also define LUT smoothing and whether that's like that process, is that getting baked out into a new LUT? What's happening there?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So LUT smoothing, like there's lots of different ways that you can think about LUT smoothing, and there's different ways of doing it. But if we look at like, lattice, for example, I'm going to use this just because there's a handy built-in way of smoothing LUTs within here. It is essentially going to, let's see here. Here's what we'll do. I'm going to go over into resolve. And let's say that like I want to smooth out my 2383. And I'm just going to look at the 1D curve of my 2383, which is like not particularly unsmooth right now, but smoothing, well, like this would be one example of smoothing. If I go to edit, limit, LPath smooth, that's going to look at each of the nodes in here and it's going to smooth them out. So if I do like, I'm going to do a big radius of like 5. Like, and then let's make this really big for you guys. Before, after. So like in this particular smoothing algorithm, it's actually
Colin, we're not
reducing.
seeing.
Oh, are you not seeing anything but resolve? Yeah. Oh, that's right. Can I solve that? 1 sec. I think I can solve this. Yeah, you guys should be able to see this now. So we're here at our baseline, and then when I go in and I smooth these curves, basically if my goal is like, oh, I want to see a bit less kind of chunking or sharp transitions in these curves, I can apply something like this. Before, after. Before, after. Can you guys see how that gets smoother? It also loses a little bit of the original character. Like you're because the smoothing algorithm has no way of sort of separating out like, all right, what is desired character versus what needs to be smoothed out. You end up losing something a little bit in the process, at least in this particular scheme. And just in general, like the ideal thing to do would be to figure out like, okay, all the pieces that created this curve, which of them are helping to create like this little bit of like, maybe I'd like to see a little bit more smoothness locally right here. Like what could I do to smooth that out? I could even like, again, this is like kind of the deeper end of look dev, but like I could pull this into something like Nuke where I can edit these curves point by point. And I can say, hey, this exact curve here, actually delete it completely so there's just a smooth connection between here and here. or move it up slightly so that there's less of this sort of like dirt, dirt type of thing. Or this is like your other option. When you go to output the LUT, increase the resolution, like make it a 65 point versus a 33 point. I'm getting into the weeds of like some kind of advanced, like, like LUT and look development type of stuff. But like hopefully that's some helpful practical visual on the idea of smoothing, that it's really just averaging things out in some kind of way so that you've got less of like a sharp variation in between the points of your LUT.
Nicholas is saying that he is wondering why Genesis was designed as a DRT, and uh, is is there any reason to use it mid-flow and convert back to a working space and then have an ACES output?
Oh, cool question. Yeah, so why was Genesis designed as a DRT? The best way to answer that is to ask a highly related question. Why was film designed as a DRT? Kind of hard question to answer, right? It just was. Like, that's just what its job is to render images in a pleasing way. So why was Genesis designed as a DRT? Because that's the system that it's modeling. Remember that Genesis is not just like, like we already looked at Contour today, my look development plugin. I can give you filmic looks with Contour. In fact, I would say the look that we're on right now is filmic in character. It has some like traits that are like reminiscent of film traits. But this is just me as a creative using good tools to model a visual aesthetic that I like. Genesis doesn't work that same way. Genesis is actually modeling out the processes that produce a film system. So why does Genesis work that way? Because film that works that way, if that makes sense. Now, in terms of the second question of like, is there room for putting Genesis in the middle of a pipeline and flipping back out to an intermediate space? I would leave that to you to explore and ask the question. Here's what I would say. After many years of like even we looked at my 2383 a minute ago here, this is a scene referred film emulation, theoretically, right? Like that's kind of what it's there to do. I've spent an embarrassing amount of time in my career as a colorist and, like LUT enthusiast and look dev nerd, trying to figure out how do I take something that gives me back a display referred image and flip it around and invert it and get it back into scene space so that I can net some kind of benefit. My conclusion after many, many years of doing it in the very best way I can think of doing it, and then having whatever benefits it affords, is that the benefits are sort of non-existent. Like I actually can't think of a reason why that's helpful other than as an abstract idea. The only thing that I would add to that is that if you have a LUT that only gets you out to SDR and you need to get to HDR, that's a situation where you're going to need to do something on the other side of that LUT to get into that other metric. But if you're looking at something like Genesis, which allows you to target like whatever display color space you want, then there's really not a downside to this. And I would say actually quite the opposite. Like now I'm targeting an HDR color space, which looks weird on my screen and on your screen because we're not looking at it in HDR. But it's actually the opposite of a downside. It's a benefit. Like the thing that we are looking for is that final rendering. Like no one like goes looking for a plugin or goes looking to build a look saying, ooh, I hope it has this like abstract, like I want this. Like nobody does that, right? All we care about at the end of the day is like, what is the net of it? What does the full journey net us? Is it something that I like? Is it something that works for my creative intent? So when we have a print, again, going back to that term that we started our conversation with today, when we have a single stage print like we do with Genesis, the only real question is like, does it do what you want? If it does what you want, then why exactly would you want to decouple it from a DRT and have them in two separate pieces, other than for some sort of abstract theoretical notion of freedom or flexibility? I think that's something that like I've fallen into a lot in my journey, and I've realized there's not actually a benefit and there's usually a downside to it, because one of the magical things about film, one of the things that we are always chasing about film, is that it is a closed system that just does a beautiful thing and doesn't afford you all the granular control in the world. That's like the downside, quote unquote. The upside is that when you don't have all the granular control in the world, you can't do ugly things. You can only get film out of film. Does that make sense to you guys? So that would be how I would think about that, is like, why was it designed that way? Because that's how film works. Can I use it in some other kind of way? You could certainly try to, but I would, really make that a proposition of assessing value, not like, how does it feel, or what have I heard about why that might be beneficial, or why like it might be helpful in a workflow, but does it actually net you as good or better of a result than you would have gotten by simply trusting the single stage print?
Question from Matt. You've suggested using HSV or color slice tool to add saturation. What about desaturating? Is the regular sat slider in the primaries good enough for just normal desaturating?
Oh, that's a good question, Matt. Yeah, so like we talk a lot about saturation, but what about desaturation, and like do the rules change? You know, I would say yeah, kind of, like they do. Like we've covered this at some point in grade school before, but always worth a recap. Let's look at, first of all, let's turn off that nightmarish live preview thing. Let's look at an image with a good range of saturations here, okay? And I'm going to pull up my basic tree here. And let's look at saturation kind of by the numbers. So there's two things to consider. Remember, I've talked about this before. Bonus points if you can remember what I'm about to say. Anytime you are talking about a saturation adjustment of any kind, positive, negative, any kind, there are two things we want to keep in mind. What is the model? Like, what is the space that we're using to define saturation? And what is the operation? This is a great thing to write down if you got a pen handy, or if you got your notes app or whatever open in your computer. Write this down. Anytime you are evaluating a saturation tool, whether it's like this custom HSV setup that I have right now, or your sat versus sat, or your primary sat, or your HDR zones sat, or your color slice sat, or like your cyan sat within the color slice, like literally any saturation tool, the thing you want to look at when you're assessing these tools is, what is the actual model being used? And is it a model that like predicts or like aligns with human notions of colorfulness in a reasonable way? And then what is the actual operation that's happening? We're going to break both those down right now. So if we look at like this HSV node, where right now I've got my color space set to HSV, and I've got channels 1 and 3 turned off. So basically just the S of HSV, my saturation channel. That's all that I'm adjusting. And as we've talked about plenty here on the channel, if I take my gain now and turn it to the right, I've got a saturation knob. And one of the things that is often like pleasing about doing sat in HSV like this is you can see I'm not getting any brighter. In fact, as saturation is being added into my colors, they're actually getting darker in a way that aligns with the human experience of color pretty well. Because if I could think about, if I actually want to make this jacket more colorful, what does that mean in a physical sense? That means a jacket which is more selective of the light that it reflects. It's only going to reflect certain wavelengths of red light. And the more saturation I want, the more selective that surface will need to be in order to give me that purer color. And what's the result of that? That means less light is being reflected. So sort of definitionally, if we're talking about saturation that feels related to our idea of like make the vest more colorful, you're going to have a loss in luminance as you increase saturation. Okay, so that's like a good thing to look out for in a model when you're to answer that first question, compared to like, if we look at the primary saturation here, the same thing doesn't hold. That red is actually getting brighter there. So if we grab a still of that, and then we look at our other saturation approach here, here's primary sat, here's HSV sat. That's probably a recap for a lot of you guys, but always good to recap. So that's the idea there. That's the model, okay? Now, let's look at how this model works when we're going the other direction. So right now, I'm doing positive gain on my HSV sat node, okay? So let's do this. Let's go the other way. Let's say I want to desaturate. And I'm going to go kind of hard with it just for the sake of a clear visual example. So here is HSV desat, and I've basically taken it down to 50%. So I'm going to turn this off, and let's go back to our main node here, and I'm going to do the same thing with my primary saturation, and we're going to take it down to 25. 25 is half of 50, so it's the same amount of desaturation. So check this out. When we're going the opposite direction, the subtractive color model actually makes the image lighter. Kind of makes sense if you think about it for a second, but it's not something that would immediately occur to us. So when you're going negative, it may actually be beneficial to use a model that looks ugly when you're going positive. Follow what I'm saying? Like in this case, it depends on what you're looking for, right? Like it's not that one is inherently better here, but like like if I'm sort of roughly assessing, I like what I'm getting more with my primary sat adjustment here than what I got by pulling HSV set out. HSV is getting kind of like, it's actually getting brighter as I pull color out. You guys with me so far there? So that's something that you can think about in terms of like, how do the rules change, or like how should I be thinking about desaturation? But since we're here, let's also cover how this can relate to that other second criteria that I gave you guys. Remember the two criteria, right? What is the color model that's being used? In this case, we're using HSV and comparing it to like straight up video saturation like we're getting here in our primaries, whatever model you want to call that. The other question is, what is the operation being performed? The operation that we've been performing in all examples thus far has been gain, right? We're basically taking our saturation channel, however we define and form that, and we're cranking it. We're multiplying it, or we're multiplying it by a number greater than 1, or we're multiplying it by a number less than 1, okay? But let's look at the other factor here of like, all right, well, what if I want to do a different type of op? Because when you're desaturating, I think what you're going to find is that, like, I don't know, let's look at this in a, like practical, like give me an assignment type of way. If I look at these two images here, or these two nodes, I should say, and I reset everything back to where it started. So like, let's say we're looking at this image and we're like, all right, it's a little too colorful for where I want to see things go. I want to pull back on the color a little bit. If we do what I just did a minute ago with just rolling back the primary sat, as we saw, like that might actually be the right model in terms of the way it's treating like the weight of my colors. But what it's not handling so well is like by the time I manage to pull enough energy off of the colorful stuff, my skin tone is getting like very, very like bleachy, like ivory, right? So this is where what is the op comes into play. So what I'd really probably want to do here, more so than what I was doing a moment ago, is if we go back over to our sat node and we look at, I'm going to go gain down, like so. And then I'm going to go gamma up. Well, what's that going to do? What that's going to do is drop the most saturated stuff, but it's going to allow me to, when I go gamma up, I'm boosting the low and medium saturation stuff. So what that's doing is allowing me to somewhat hold on to my skin tone while I drop my peak saturations. See that? So just check this out. Like, let's set aside the subtractiveness conversation for a second and just look at like, our little girl's shoulder here, or her arm, against her skin and against mom's skin. Here's before desat, here's after. Before, after. So by combining gamma and gain, I'm able to get some of that excess saturation, or get some saturation out of the image that I might not want without losing saturation in skin, as opposed to where we were a moment ago. I mean, let's do it like this. Let's just reset our gamma. Say like this would just be straight up gain down. Like you can see, and let's make it a fair fight. Check this out. I'm gonna grab a still of what we just did. I'm gonna reset the gamma, and I'm just gonna match, using only gain, the level of saturation on her arm. So check that out. Now this is holding. So like if my note was to desaturate, because we've got like the reds and the blues are feeling a little too colorful, I'm satisfying that in both cases, but in one case I'm losing tons and tons of color in skin tone, and in the other I'm maintaining it almost exactly where it was before. Okay, you with me so far? So then the last thing for our last trick, okay, great. How do we combine these things? Because we just looked at, well, the primary saturation gives us a better response in terms of color weight potentially, but being able to do things in this dedicated node allows us to shape saturation so that we're not losing saturation in areas that are already very low in saturation. Well, check this out. One option you can do this with, one way you can do it, it's not the only way, but one thing you could do is flip this to HSL. And now we're going to get that same weight that we had before. Now the scale may change a little bit. So like in this case, I actually feel like I'm gaining some saturation now. But like something like that, now I'm trimming sat out of her sleeve, but maintaining saturation here. And I'm no longer getting that like sort of like increased luminance and brightness that we were getting a moment ago. So I don't know if you're able to follow every twist and turn, if everyone was able to follow that, but this is a good example. You can go back and rewatch this of how thinking your way through what is my model and what is my op can help you arrive at the best outcome for whatever you're trying to do. In this case, what we're trying to do, the sort of candidate task is like, hey, let's desaturate and let's also be mindful not to lose all the life in our low medium saturations in areas like skin. Hope that helps.
Sydney is asking about the interview you did with Jill. She mentioned contrast in midtones, warm and highlights, cyan and shadows. Can you show us how to do that, what that is, and how we can make any camera look like that?
Yeah, great topic. Let's do that. So, I love Jill. I love interviewing her. I love chatting with her. She's just not only such a talented colorist, but she's a really good communicator, and she's able to break things down into that sort of like simple recipe that you just repeated really well. Like, all right, every time I hear her talk, I'm like, okay, I feel like I can do that. I feel like I got that. So let's look at an example of that. There's different ways to think about this, but here's how some of the parameters we're going to put on it. Number one, in the context of that response that she gave, she was talking more about something we would want to impose as a look than something we would want to manually do shot after shot. So we could do it with our grading tools and we could do it shot after shot. That's not typically where I would introduce those flavors, and I use these flavors all the time. And if we were to introduce those flavors in that way, we would use different tools than what I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to show you how to get that recipe applied at a look level as something that we just ride with. And what's fun actually is like we're kind of already there with Contour with my look development plugin, but we're going to turn this off and we're just going to do it manually using like good old fashioned resolve tools. Okay. So here's the basic formula that Jill is talking about. To do this, we're going to use our custom curves. Okay. Now, step one, what does she say? Increase midtone contrast, right? So here's what I want to do. I want to preserve my middle gray. I'm going to take my DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray power grade here and drop it onto an empty node upstream. This is just my exposure chart, which is a free download in the description for today's video that I've got dropped down to a total steps of 1, and I've set my tone curve to DaVinci Intermediate. That way I've got this patch of middle gray. And I'm going to use that here in node number 3 and eyedropper it. And I'm going to use this as an anchor point and say this point should not change, because if it does, I'm not changing contrast, I'm changing exposure. They're highly related, but you can anchor so that your exposure is not shifting with your contrast change. And by the way, some of the extra steps that we're going through right now, this is like why I created my look development plugin Contour that we have over here. But I want to give you guys a recipe that you can use regardless of whether you have Contour today. So here would be like the basic approach that you could take from here. If we take our top end and stretch it out, and we take our low end and go like so, like this is extreme, but we're going to go kind of extreme. Do you guys see how a couple things are true right now? First of all, this point has not moved. If I like go to a new node here, I haven't moved this control point. Everything else has moved around it. The second thing is that the slope has increased. Like this is a steeper line than where we were a moment ago, right? That's contrast increase. And when Jill talks about strong contrast in the middle, she's saying through the body of the image, through where I've pegged my middle gray right here, you want to see a net increase in your contrast, okay? And then what you're going to do, like this is just like basic film sort of like properties or aesthetics that you're going to see over and over again, is you want to take that and then we're going to create some control points here. So I'm going to create one here and another one around here, and we're going to create a shoulder such that as we're approaching the edges, we're not crashing into the ceiling, we're rolling over. So like, here's a good way to think about this that when it finally clicked in my head this way, I was like, wow, I wish someone explained that to me a lot sooner. When you're doing a filmic contrast curve, you are increasing contrast in the middle of the image. Because, notice, even after what I just did, this middle section is still steeper in slope than we had here. This is flatter. Where are we? This is flatter. This is steeper, right? In the middle. But what's the deal with it on the edges? On the edges, we're actually not increasing contrast, we are decreasing contrast. And why do we go increase contrast in the middle, decrease contrast in the edges? So that we don't clip things out, so that we don't smash through the ceiling and lose image data. If we were to just stick with what I started with a moment ago, we would have things like, even the snow in this image that's potentially just going to crash through the ceiling. It happens not to be in this case, but like you're going to have brighter, like things in the very bright end or the very dark end of the curve that are going to ungracefully crash into the edge of what your display can do. Okay, so that's what Jill is talking about. That's kind of the first thing of like, all right, strong in the middle, soft at the edges. Okay, that's number one. And as a bonus, you could do like maybe a little bit of something like this, like lift your black point just a touch in the bottom end. So like that's a really nice contrast curve, right? By the way, pro tip, some of you guys already know about this. I would treat this as a separate piece, as its own piece, and I would do a key output gain once I've got it set and say, all right, that's great. It might just be a little bit too much. I'm going to drop it to like 65%, 0.65. Now, instead of having to go in and refine all these pieces endlessly, which can be a little time consuming, now I'm just kind of calibrating like, all right, I like this curve. Just how much of it do I really want? Now I've got that set up. Okay, so next thing, how are we going to handle this warm in the highlights, cool in the shadows bit that Jill mentioned? So we're going to do this in a separate piece. We could do this all in one curve, but it's just going to make for a very touchy curve that's difficult to work with. So I'm just going to do it in a separate curve. And we're going to start off with the same thing of grabbing our DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray and anchoring. Because just like I anchored my tonal or my contrast adjustment, I want to anchor the color balance that I'm about to change around middle exposure. Basically, when we say cool in the shadows, warm in the highlights, well, how do we decide what are shadows and highlights? Best way to decide what are shadows and highlights is to use your middle gray as that dividing line. Say, hey, some amount of the image below this point is going to get pushed cool, and some amount of the image above this point is going to get pushed warm. But I know that nothing below this is going to go warm, and nothing above this is going to go cool. Does that make sense? Sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but these guideposts, these parameters, these boundaries are essential when you're building stuff like this that you want to be able to do quickly, you want to be able to do consistently, and you want to get great results. Okay, so we've got that set up. For this, I'm going to ungang my channels. And easiest way to go about this for me is to go to your red channel, and I'm just going to subtract some red from the low end. What does that mean when I'm subtracting red? Well, that means that I'm leaving green and blue behind. What is that? That's cyan. Okay, it's not the only hue you could use, but cyan is a nice one. Generally better, gonna be better than just doing like a pure red. So here would be like adding quite a bit of cyan into the low end. Okay. And it's amazing to me how much of this you can do without it feeling worked on. Like this might be a little strong, but like if I take that to around that same level of like 65%, the only time it feels like, oh wow, you're obviously adding a bunch of cyan to the low end is when you turn it off. When it's on, you're just like, yeah, it just feels good, right? So this is split toning, by the way, that we're talking about. This is something that the split module is one of my favorite modules in Contour. It's designed to really streamline and optimize everything that we're doing right now. I've also got a video that we did, I think, end of last year on split toning. And I think we called it like a master painter technique because it's something you see in all visual media, not just film. But if we look at this in our low end, by the way, guys, another hot tip, oftentimes, probably more often than not, this is all I do for a split tone. So like my riff on Jill's recipe of like, oh, warm highlights, soft shadows, or warm highlights, cool shadows, I should say. I often am just doing the cool shadows part and not doing the warm highlights part at all. But if I wanted to, here's what that would look like. I'm going to go over here to my curves. And in this case, we're going to take our red and we're going to go up with it like so. And then I'm also going to chase it with green. Because if I just go pure red, that's going to turn things like skin, like fire engine red, and I don't want that. If I go green as much as red, that's going to basically be pointing me straight toward yellow. Also not something I want. I want something in between, right? I want to kind of be aiming somewhere in between these two, maybe roughly along that skin tone line. So this is like some version of that, okay? And so this would now be, and I'm just like letting this curve kind of like play out, like without letting the red, green, and blue come back together, if that makes sense. So something like that, okay? And we're already at that 65% strength, which might even still be too much. Like maybe I want to do like 0.5. Okay. So that's the basic recipe, and that's doing it with nothing but custom curves. You could spend a bunch of time finessing this and getting it dialed in to do exactly what you want and fitting it to like lots of different shots, and then save this as a power grid if you want to. And if you look at like, this is one of my favorite exercises in motion imaging. Like let's look at, I'm going to scrub a little bit deeper here so that we can see our subject's eyes. There we go. If we look at the net of what we've just done, that's huge, right? Like if you didn't do anything else in a look but build some custom curves using Resolve native tools, this might not be the fastest, it might not be the easiest, the quickest thing to revise, but you can get great results with nothing but this. And because of these anchors that I have imposed on my process, or because of these boundaries that I've imposed, this is going to travel. Like check this out. It doesn't just look good on that shot. It looks good here. Looks good here. Because the main reason for that is that everything is being anchored around middle gray, so that I've got neutrals at middle gray in my split tone scheme, and my contrast curve is not biasing exposure up or down in a way that's either going to make an image look better or worse, depending on what the image is. So for that reason, because of those principles, this is again like where look design differs from grading. This is something that's going to travel really well. So that's might be a recap for some of you guys, but always good to recap the basics. And that would be how I would go about doing kind of my version of what Jill is talking about. And like I said, you could play with, especially in your, with any of these pieces, you can play with the way that you set these control points up and where you push them around to. But this is a pretty good framework to get you started.
Denise is wondering, what is your approach to grading and creating a look that best accommodates clips that have a big shift in them, such as moving from indoors to outdoors?
Oh, that's a great question. So how do you grade or create a look for clips that have a big shift in them? Here's what I would say. If you were to ask, like, I don't know, in the scenario you're describing, I don't know if these are shots that you've gathered or your friend gathered or if it's just a client, but whoever gathered that image, this is a great question to ask if you're working with clients or if you're working with buddies or you're working with yourself for that matter. It's a great question to ask of yourself, even if you're the one who gathered the image. You play it back, you look at like, all right, what part of this image did you expose for? Like, were you just, the answer you might get is like, oh, I don't know, I was just trying to make it all look kind of decent. Like sometimes that'll be the answer. More often than not, there was a moment that was most important to the person gathering the image. So like, well, it's fine if we're a little bit hot when we step out of the movie theater, but I got to be able to see them when they're still in the movie theater or when they're in the darkened bar or whatever the shot is, right? Everyone's got a moment that they're really designing a shot for, and you'll find this more and more as you're working with higher experienced filmmakers, right? But pretty much all of us across the board, we're going to design around a moment and then do the best we can to make things feel good leading up to and following that moment in like a long shot, for example. Here's like a great thing that I feel like re-emphasizing a lot in my color grading practice with my color grading, like my colorist coaching clients and, you know, everyone that I work for, everyone that I work with and everyone who I teach. We don't want to spend too much time on defense when we're color grading. We want to go on offense. Be like, all right, find that moment. Make that moment sing, man. Like get in there with your look, get in there with your grade and make that moment that you wanted to look and feel and taste a certain way and that you exposed so that it would be like what you wanted to see. Make that moment sing. And then you're going to bring up everything around it to look as good as you can. Okay. So how does that play in look development versus grading? Well, in look development, you're going to set your overall look for that moment, for those moments. That's really just a variation on something I talk about all the time with look development of like, you want to set your look for the bullseye, the 10 out of 10 moments where like, man, that crew, that DP, that like director, you know, that team, they showed up for this shot. They showed up for this day. That looks 10 out of 10. That's when they executed most highly on what they were trying to do, right? Build your look against that. You might have to compromise and back off on it in certain ways when you're looking at, all right, what was the day when they were short on time, didn't have the gear they needed to get the shot off, actors were walking off set, rain started coming down, like all the calamity that happens when you're out in production. There's going to be those shots too. And you can make compromises in your look or in your grade with those shots But because we know you're going to need to make some kind of compromise like that, you want to start with like, this is, if I didn't have to make any of those compromises, this is what I would do. And then you back off from that point. Does that make sense? So that's how I would think about it in terms of the look. And then in terms of the grade, it's kind of the same process that you just repeat through again. Like, do we have a shot that kind of plays out through some different environments like you're talking about? I don't have that right now. What a bummer. But it's going to be the same process again. You're going to look for, all right, where is that moment? Grade for that moment. Like now you've hit it, you've done all you can for it in your look. Now do everything you can for it in your grade. Like make the contrast feel perfect. Guide the eye to exactly where it needs to go. Shape out, like get the exposure sitting right where it belongs. Like everything gets graded to that moment. And then you're going to use keyframes in Resolve to build to that point and maintain that level that you've set. You follow what I'm saying? Whether we're talking about look dev or whether we're talking about the grade, it is impossible to maintain a level that you've never achieved. But once you've achieved that level, it's actually not that hard to be like, all right, what can we do to maintain this level of quality? It doesn't mean it needs to look identical. That's another thing I would say about shots that vary. It can be very easy to like over medicate the problem. Like the example that I just gave of like a character or a couple characters like walking out of a dark bar at, like 2:00 in the afternoon. You're probably going to need to animate some kind of correction for that unless the camera team was just like so on it and there was like lighting cues happening and it just got captured perfectly in camera. You're probably gonna have to do some kind of something to help that image along. But it can be very easy to over medicate the problem. We don't want it to feel like the light doesn't change when you come out of a dark bar at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Of course the light changes. Of course the contrast ratio changes. Of course the color balance changes, right? So that can be another really good tip to carry into these things is like, what do I need to maintain versus like, what am I actually supposed to let vary? Like you don't want it to go from being well exposed to 8 stops over, most likely, if you're supposed to see stuff, but like for it to feel hotter, that's not a problem, right? So that would be another thing to add into the kind of recipe for what we're talking about is don't over medicate the problem. Like step 1 would be like, get everything to that 10 out of 10 level for the most important moment in the shot, and then maintain that level within reason. Maintain it in the sense that like this feels experientially right, not like, oh, I want to make sure my scopes don't move, or I want to make sure my exposure and my tonality don't feel any different, or that my balance is consistent. Like I found myself like falling into that trap so much with like long oneers that vary in exposure and balance, where you're like, wait, why am I trying to do that? Like it should feel different. Like we want the shot to evolve. We just want to feel like we're kind of like in a musical key, or we're maintaining a certain feeling or aesthetic in the image. Hope that helps.
All right. Can contour be combined with Genesis for split curve? Split curve, will it break the image?
Oh, great question. Can contour be combined with Genesis for a split curve? Yeah, absolutely. We talked about this in the workshop that I mentioned a couple minutes ago that we did here a few weeks back with me, Dr. Mitch Bogdanowicz, and Steve Yedlin, ASC. You can totally combine those things. Or actually, I'm lying about that. We didn't cover that in that workshop at all, but we did cover it in another session that was right before that workshop, which is why I'm confused. But yes, absolutely. Like, to round things out for today, the way that I think about contour versus Genesis is like Genesis is a photochemical look dev tool and contour is a digital look dev tool. They have different properties, different means of achieving the same thing. But like, let's take this as an example. Like, let's use Genesis. And by the way, like there's a free trial of this available for anyone who wants to go check it out. You can keep it as long as you want and play around with it and decide if it's something that you love and want to grab a license of. You can have that trial license indefinitely and play around with it. But let's say like, we're looking at this and I've got a specific thing that I'm wanting to do here. Okay. So like when I look at Genesis, if I like look at my curve, there's a little bit of a split thing happening here. And if you know what to do with the tool, you can get even more of a split like I'm getting now. But what I can't do is say like what hue I want to get down here. So I could say like, let's get the type of split that I would get by, like mimicking certain behaviors of the film system by adjusting these things. Or I could say like, no, let's leave that maybe a little bit more neutral, maybe even try to neutralize it even more, like something like this. And there's a whole deep dive we could do on like the sliders I'm moving and why and how I know it's going to do what I'm trying to get. But let's say our starting point is this. And now I'm like, no, specifically, I want to get a slightly bluish cyan in the very bottom of the image. That's something like I love Genesis. It's been like so much fun. I loved building this tool. I love even more that this tool exists because I use it every day in my grading practice. I'm such a fan of it. But one thing that it is not designed to do, that it will never do well, is what I just said, where you have a specific recipe that you're trying to realize. That's just not the way that film works. And as a result, that's not the way that Genesis works. So if you wanted something like that, instead of using Genesis, I would 100% use Contour and reset everything here and go into this split module that I mentioned earlier. Again, I'm going to go kind of fast here. Like there's some documentation and resource out there available for anyone who is a Genesis or a Contour user to go deeper on these things. And actually, some of that's even available if you grab a trial of Genesis or Contour. So, but if I just say like, hey, I'm going to move my low versus high strength all the way to the bottom. So I'm just cooling the bottom end. And I'm going to set my floor divergence like so. And I can actually pick my exact shadow hue. Like you can see the swatch in my image. You can kind of see that, like it's sort of hiding because it's a medium sap, but right now it's pointed like to a point that's a little bit greener than cyan. So let's say I want it to go like just a slightly bluish cyan. Like here's my default, and we're just going to swing it slightly bluish. I can achieve that level of control and precision while still getting a really, really clean outcome. That's a trigger for me. Anytime I'm like, I have the exact recipe and I want to provide it and I want to see it realized on the screen quickly and cleanly, that's a cue to me, like, hey, throw Contour on the stack. As opposed to like, hey, I have a general idea. I know what I'm looking for. And I know how I can influence the parameters within Genesis to work like a film creative to get even more of exactly what I'm looking for. But these things are all interactive. Like my favorite analogy that Dr. Bogdanowicz gave is the idea of like you push on a beanbag on one side and things change in other areas of the beanbag. So you can't be as targeted or as specific. And that can be a really beautiful thing, but it's a very different approach, a very different like sort of way of thinking about your look than what I'm doing here with Contour. I'm like, no, I want this specific thing. So yes, they can totally be combined. They can totally be combined cleanly. They both work great with each other. It's more a question of like, conceptually, how do I decide what the right tool is for the job I'm trying to accomplish and when to use which? Does that make sense? All right, my friends, as usual, a grade school power hour has flown by. Thank you guys so much for hanging out today. This was a great sesh. We got to cover lots of fun stuff. And I don't know. I just love y'all. I love getting to hang out with you guys. It's such a privilege getting to hang out with people from all over the world who love color grading as much as I do and love deepening their craft and their knowledge and asking interesting questions and exploring the answers with you guys. It's a privilege, and I love y'all and I appreciate you guys. So thank you for being here today. I hope you have an awesome rest of your week, and I will see you guys here on the channel super soon. Let me go to this so I can actually wave and say goodbye. Have a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week, and see you guys super soon. Take care.